Content warning. This episode features an in-depth discussion of emotional abuse of queer people and extreme homophobia. Viewer discretion is advised.
A phrase that pops up a lot from the ex-RCP members is, how could this have happened? And why didn't we know? And to me at least, it seems very self-explanatory. They didn't know because the very culture they had submersed themselves in did not welcome curiosity. And this homophobia and abusive behavior survived for so long because the RCP, like most hierarchies, hates accountability. Many of them openly admit that because they believed in communist discipline, they publicly defended party policies they didn't agree with. Redbrick, 2013.
As for any communist group, the collapse of the USSR and global communism in the early 90s hurt the RCP immensely. Even being part of the insurrectionist sort of Maoism was on the decline, as one of their main international allies, the terrorist group Shining Path, was finally pushed back by the Peruvian government. So-called Chairman Gonzalo, otherwise known as Abimael Guzman, was arrested on September 12, 1992. He was discovered to be hiding out in a middle-class neighborhood in the city of Lima, while his followers fought the government on the countryside. Much like his supposed ally, Chairman Bob would continue his exile in France, leading his group thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. At this point, RCP's sour reputation only continued to lower, the last hurrah of relevancy in the 1992 LA riots, which were over the acquittal of two cops who had savagely beaten a young black man named Rodney King over drunk driving. The RCP then continued to fade into irrelevancy. Despite this, they continued the rash of wild protests and continued to work in some of the most poor and disadvantaged areas, including the housing project Cabrini Green in Chicago. Still, nothing could push the RCP out of its spiral. So, the RCP began to adapt, thawing out its long frozen positions on various topics. The first part of this thaw was the end of the ban of queer members. Starting in 2001, the RCP reversed its policy on gays in the organization. In a long, rambling screed entitled On the Position of Homosexuality in the New Draft Program, an anonymous group of party members wrote how homosexuality had strong historical bases, and that gays were part of human society. In this bizarre second-wave feminist screed mixed with communist jargon, they offer a sympathetic view of the old policy, as it was outlined in an article from a 1988 party publication. They effectively stated it was merely a flawed line, not without merit.
We did try to clarify that our view was not that homosexuality was a social problem analogous to prostitution, and we made it very clear that we were never talking about roundups or coercion to stop people from practicing homosexuality. Rather, we made the analogy to religion, something which will remain in socialist society and which people will have the right to practice, but which will ultimately lose its social role in attraction. Notwithstanding these serious errors and shortcomings, there were a number of important positive aspects of the 1988 Revolution article. Perhaps the most positive aspect to uphold from that article is the approach, which is not that common and which we continue to believe is very correct and decisive, of striving to situate any discussion and evaluation of the social practices of human sexuality, including all forms of homosexuality, in relation to the woman question, the oppression of women, and the strategic need to struggle for the fullest emancipation of women as part of the revolutionary transformation of all of society.
All in all, there was no strong condemnation of their prior policy. There are minor bits where something is said to be wrong, too broad or flawed, but then it's followed up with a, well, we had a reason for that was good.
Our discussion of lesbianism in the Revolution article still seems accurate in some respects, but it does one-sidedly focus on lesbianism as a conscious and ultimately too conservative form of escape from or resistance to the oppression of women by men. While it is correct to demarcate the outlook of radical feminism from a thoroughgoing revolutionary position and to criticize a political and ideological program that would claim lesbianism as an answer to the oppression of women, the practice of lesbianism in and of itself is not necessarily an ideological statement or a political program, reformist or otherwise. Our party years ago did witness some militant feminists turn to lesbianism in an attempt to get away from relations of male domination and then go on to lose their radical edge. The above self-criticism should not obscure the fact that there is much that is worth preserving in that 88 Revolution article.
They even went so far as to defend how long they preserved their homophobic policy.
It wouldn't do any good if we simply cater to fashion and scramble to try to correct an old position by simply adopting whatever has become popular at any given time, and without being pretty confident that a new position actually better corresponds to material reality and represents an improvement over the old. Searching for the truth with any real integrity of purpose and method is a process which has to be done right, and this takes time and resources. And the process of forging a new draft program served as an important juncture for stepping back to carry on serious re-examination. Which brings us to a second point. We are a revolutionary party, which necessarily entails a broad and complex agenda. We are not single-issue activists in relation to this or any other single issue, and we also cannot function like individual scientists, historians, or social scientists, though we embrace and investigate all such disciplines and more. We are a revolutionary party, and as such we seek to work in a collectively disciplined way to apply the scientific method of dialectical and historical materialism and the scientific viewpoint and method of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism as a whole to all spheres of human life and to all the major questions of the day, as we constantly struggle for a better, more accurate, and more comprehensive understanding of material reality.
This piece ends with a muted praise of Chairman Bob as, quote, our party's chair, and how this was all in the process of, quote, cultivating a genuine and ongoing openness to new ideas, and a certain non-dogmatic flexibility in dealing with the dissent or other forms of disagreement among the masses. Right. There was also a far more sweeping change. Soon after, Bob Avakian revealed the creation of the New Synthesis. While it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when the New Synthesis was born, it was sometime around the mid-2000s. Admittedly, I found the manifesto a tedious read and effectively skimmed it. After months of reading this stuff, I just got kind of burned out. Nothing here is intellectually engaging. From what I gathered, it was just a retread of old Marxist talking points with Bob Avakian added in as a key thinker. It also supposes that the RCP needed an internal cultural revolution to save the communism in the party. Honestly, I saw much of this to be a series of word salads that effectively called for reform of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism in a way that the RCP found more palatable. Honestly, I found it similar to reading the works about Juche, the ideology of North Korea. From this, we can gather this is just a totalitarian window dressing, an ideology created to enforce a dictatorship, or in the RCP's case, a cult. It's no different than reading the theology of Heaven's Gate or the fucking Moonies. To me, it's all nonsense, and I'm not gonna make any sense of it beyond this. That makes this work extremely flawed. Bitch about it in the comments. This revision of Marxist dogma pissed off the RCP's international allies. Well, what for you remained? They went and even wrote an entire book decrying the New Synthesis as a portrayal of Maoism. Seriously, the book titled Against Avakianism is about 250 pages long. More importantly, the New Synthesis proved to be the breaking point for some longtime RCP members. Already disheartened by the decades of homophobia, members began to leave, including RCP old guard Mike Eli. After 30 or so years of membership, he left and formed a new group, the Kasama Project. An odd hybrid of a blog and a reading club, Kasama attracted exiles of the communist movement ranging from ex-RCP members to even some outspoken former Trotskyists. The group's founding document is a series of essays called 9 Letters to Our Comrades. It provides one of the clearest looks into the machinations of the extremely secretive and paranoid RCP. Eli sharply criticized the burgeoning cult, which he argues was not yet fully formed in the 80s. He used a comparison of the party's Revolution magazine in 1980 to an issue from 2000, which went from May Day celebrations to upholding the glory of Chairman Bob. Before, there were rallies and efforts to be tribunes of the people. At this point, much of the party work was based around selling newspapers and something called AP&P, or developing the appreciation, promotion, and popularization of Bob Avakian. Eli describes a sterile environment revolving around a man with no intellectual curiosity. Ignoring breakthroughs in historical research and more, Avakian instead focused on maintaining an old, rigid doctrine. It also adds that Avakian had disconnected from reality because of this small frame of reference due to his lack of intellectual curiosity. Overall, 9 Letters is a takedown of Avakian in his own words, words, showing how vapid and lifeless the new synthesis really is, which I believe lends to my own Juche comparisons, though I am certain Eli would completely disagree with my assessment. The RCP naturally wrote a response, but much like the 9 letters themselves, really didn't move much around left circles except as more proof of what people already assumed about the RCP. What would make some waves was Kasama's publication of a series of blog conversations from 2011. Queer ex-members of the RCP would reveal how they were shunned, attacked, and more for just being themselves. Eventually, it was published as Out of the Red Closet in 2012, which curated these conversations and posts from online discussions within Kasama. The first of these was by someone named Libri Devrim, who was a lesbian member of the RCP. She joined in the 80s as a member of the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade. She was openly in a relationship with another woman. Shunned by her family, she found solace in her comrades within the brigade, who accepted her. That is, until the local leadership found out about her sexuality, and they were furious. She was immediately shut out from participation for months until RCP leadership called her and requested to meet.
They were there to explain to me what reality was and what a communist view supposedly was. Why being a lesbian arose from unjustified hostilities towards men as a whole. How it was like being a feminist separatist, and how in the new society, men wouldn't hurt women, and so women would no longer respond to their oppression by becoming gay. Their argument was that lesbianism was a form of reformism because it sought relief from oppression by developing a lifestyle within capitalism. They made a series of deductive arguments, very divorced from reality and my own situation, that lesbianism was an ideological choice that embodied a reformist political program and that was therefore not compatible with being a communist revolutionary. Let me remind you that all of this was happening to me when I was a high school student, just barely starting to sort out life, love, and sexuality. Looking back, it seems clearer that they had reproduced within revolutionary ranks and using communist rhetoric, prejudices, arguments, and repressive practices that were not far removed from right-wing religious nuts and homophobes.
Devra mentioned a sort of struggle session where she was forced to admit her masturbation habits and being berated for her sexuality as it was, quote, objectifying women. Devrim accepted the homophobic criticism at first, apologizing to the other girl she was attracted to for, quote, objectifying her. She was allowed back in, but under close supervision. She was encouraged to live in shared housing with other members multiple times, eventually acquiescing after getting her GED. The entire time, she continued to repress her sexuality. Eventually, she found her breaking point during a discussion group and began to passionately defend gay activists. The other members would viciously fight back.
Each meeting was a battle. We weren't studying and discussing and criticizing. We were fighting with words and quotes and sources. I was totally outgunned. I had gone to a crappy public school and never graduated from college. Unlike my leadership, who were well educated and had apparently memorized the entire canon of MLM theory. I was a slow reader and had difficulty with understanding what I read. Every time they struggled with me, I felt stupider. I couldn't keep up, much less argue for what I believed. But inside, I always knew I was gay and that it wasn't a reaction to men's oppression. It wasn't because I had had bad experiences with men or wanted to promote bourgeois ideals. In fact, I wanted to accept being gay. I wanted to celebrate it because, in the end, being a lesbian was an integral part of what made me human and made me the person I was. I wanted to embrace it and be honest about how I really thought and felt.
She caved once again and began dating a male member of the party. It didn't last.
I tried, but I just didn't have feeling for him that I would have towards other women. We moved in together, and I hoped that eventually I would develop feelings for him, but it didn't happen. I liked him a lot and loved spending time with him, but I dreaded having sex with him. Eventually, we stopped having sex. He was very supportive and caring, but still very hurt that I didn't find him attractive sexually. He was one of the first people who told me that he thought the RCP's position on homosexuality was bullshit. When he said that, we were in the RCP's Revolution bookstore, and I shushed him. I didn't want either of us to get in trouble.
Eventually, she drifted away from the RCP until the line changed in 2002. She was welcomed back in, but found that there was no accountability for the last 20 years of homophobia.
I never saw any real self-criticism from the RCP's leadership. I never heard anyone say, hey, we totally fucked up, and this adversely affected people in the party. People were pushed back into the closet, and shit, we're sorry about that. We bought into these homophobic lines being pushed by the religious right, and we contributed to oppressing GLBT people, and that was wrong. Let's examine how and why we embraced a fucked up line. How had this been possible? What does it mean that it was done for decades with a scientific pretense? Let's evaluate what its impact was to our members, our supporters, gay people generally, and our cause. Instead, it was just like, okay, you can be in the party and be openly gay now. There was no honest self-criticism or accountability happening. So I guess for the RCP, it was all over and done with. But for me, it wasn't. At that point, I just couldn't live with myself if I had stayed, so I left.
Another ex-member, a gay man named Andrew Copper, also recounted abuse. He had joined back when the RCP was still the Revolutionary Union during his college years. For years, he was living openly as a gay man with his partner Mark. Mark was tragically killed in an accident in 1980. Copper then decided to drown his grief in activist work for the newly rechristened RCP. After a struggle session where he admitted he had erred in dropping out of politics, he was invited to join as a full member. As a part of this process, he had to interview, describing his personal background in detail. Then, he mentioned his relationship with Mark. At the time, Copper had no idea that the RCP or even the RU were as homophobic as they were. He never brought up Mark at any point, as it wasn't relevant to, well, anything that they were doing. Apparently, most people assumed that he was just a friend or a roommate. His application was put on hold. Copper recalls being mistreated by local leaders, and at one point being screamed at for dropping a box at the bookstore. Then the struggle sessions began.
I began the first of a series of meetings with my leader, a party member who was a former lesbian, and several other people from the party to discuss the homosexuality question. The discussion of the homosexuality question were about as you'd expect. There was a little actual discussion. We read through the Revolutionary magazine article on the question of homosexuality and the emancipation of women from 1988. We talked about what it meant and how it applied specifically to our lives. Well, my life. The party member, who was a former lesbian, told me her story of being hurt by men, turning to women to avoid pain, feeling like women were superior to men, and wanting a society of just women who loved and nurtured each other, etc. The punchline of the story, of course, is that she realized she was wrong and joined the party. I thought the discussion was ridiculous, and I said so.
The ideological component struck Copper as utterly twisted, so one member tried to frame it another way.
One of the discussion's participants, a member, not a leader, said that being gay made me vulnerable in a way that heterosexual men were not, as I could be arrested for having sex. We lived in a state with sodomy laws, and just like the RCP's points of discipline for party members forbade the use of illegal drugs to avoid being set up for legal problems, I was told that any decision I made to have sex in the future could have a legal impact on me and the party, and thus put us both at risk. This seemed rather dramatic, but at the time, I agreed with them that it was a possibility. I had a friend who had been arrested and charged with lewd acts for having sex with his partner at a state campground while camping, even though they were in a tent and no one was around other than the nosy state ranger.
In the end, Copper would not budge on the subject, was eventually separated from the others he had been working with.
I was totally isolated with no contact from anyone and was told not to go to the bookstore or to any public events. The shunning continued for months. People would not talk to me. I ran into a comrade at the gas station and he said hello, but he didn't want to engage in conversation. At a protest, I happened to stand near two people selling the Revolutionary Worker, and they quickly moved away from me. I approached one, a woman I'd known for years, and asked why she didn't want to talk to me. She'd been told specifically not to talk to me, she said, for security reasons. That was the moment at which I realized it was all over.
Despite all the hours, free labor, and dedication, he was made a non-person. Still faithful, he returned all of his remaining party property, including an $18 donation he was given post-exile by a supporter. He was too ashamed of himself to turn it down, partially out of fear to explain why he was no longer involved. Other ex-members remember similar stories as these two. The same tired pattern would rear its ugly head. Someone would inadvertently be outed or argue against the homophobic line after it was revealed casually. Then the struggle sessions would begin until the person would be shunned, despite the work that they put it, despite agreeing with all other political lines, despite the loyalty to the party, despite the dedication to the party, despite everything. Sometimes heterosexual members would be totally unaware of the policy as well, and then either be badgered into supporting it or leave in disgust. Alyssa Hill, a straight member, recalled Susie, a young lesbian radical who supported the revolutionary policy of the party, but was also forced into the conversion therapy struggle sessions. Hill recalls Susie even being abused for having a stutter, mocked and berated by leadership who clearly wanted her gone.
I figured out who my leader's leader was, or at least who I thought was my leader's leader, and I wrote a letter saying I thought Susie was being discriminated against because she was gay and that they weren't inviting her to anything, and that I had been told not to ask about it for security reasons, but that Susie had volunteered to me that she was being excluded, and no one from RPC was talking to her anymore. I took the letter, and after a meeting, gave it to a man I thought was my leader's leader, telling him that I needed to get this to the party leadership. He was not happy to take it and gave it back without looking, telling me to give it to my leader. I said no, I need this to go above her. So he took it, I think to avoid a scene more than anything else. The next day, my leader met with me. She was pissed. I was told in no uncertain terms to stop butting into other people's business and that what was going on didn't concern me. Again, allusions were made to party security and that I was potentially violating.
Still, Susie tried to participate and was eventually forced into more talks that were really just more of these struggle sessions at various fast food restaurants.
One woman began to berate her in the meeting, saying she was petty bourgeois and that she wasn't understanding the party's position because she was choosing not to and wasn't really committed. The last meeting she had with them, it must have been really bad because she cried for hours with me over the phone. At one point she told me,
After this, Hill recalls Susie being made an unperson and then was advised by other members of the party to not ask about her.
Susie never left or was officially kicked out. She was just separated, and no one contacted her again. Her newspaper subscription was suspended, even though she had already paid for a full year. She never tried to come to events at the bookstore, so I never knew if they were planning on telling her to leave or if they were just going to freeze her out and not talk to her.
Despite this news split, despite the dirty laundry being laid out yet again, the RCP still continued to limp along. With the rise of the internet, RCP's wild stunts would be reported on various blogs and indie media websites outside of Kasama, with equal levels of mockery and warnings of caution, as the cult of personality around Chairman Bob only grew worse. By this time, you'd start to see Chairman Bob being called BA, which led to much mockery by some lefty satirists. Avakian continued to write, the wild demonstrations continued to occur, and they relentlessly recruited on college campuses, with only a smattering of success as groups like the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and even the International Socialist Organization, swiped up many more members with their youthful exuberance. But people are still joining the RCP, and thus it continues. But how? And why?
It feels so simple, loving always. It feels just right, I can't explain.